The second of the looping structures that we're going to learn about is a while loop. Now, if you remember in the for loop, we can have a start value, an end value, and an increment by. In the while loop, we're going to be able to split those three values out. So there will be a start value, an initial value, and in the while loop, there is a condition. That condition is going to be the ending point, and then we're going to tab in and do stuff, but we need to have some kind of a increment by. In the for loop, if it never incremented, we would never be able to get out of the for loop. In the while loop, we can manually set that increment by, and I'm going to call it change the condition. We need to be able to change the condition so that we can get out of a while loop. So here is an example. I'm going to set my initial value to 0. I'm going to say while count is less than 5, that condition looks remarkably like a condition that I would have on an if structure. I'm going to tab in and we're just going to print our count variable. And then I'm going to change the condition by incrementing my count by 1 each time I go through the loop. And this will print 0 to 4 because as soon as my count variable is incremented to 5, the condition on the while loop, 5 is no longer less than 5, and so it will let me out of the loop. Here's another example. I'm going to set my initial value or my start value to 14. I say while count is greater than or equal to 11, this once again looks remarkably like a condition on an if structure. I'm just going to print my count variable to see what it looks like. But now I'm going to decrement my count variable by 1 each time I go through the loop. So this should start printing at 14, and each time through the loop it will decrement it down to ultimately 11. And then when I decrement my counter one more time to 10, 10 is no longer greater than or equal to 11, so it will get out of the while loop. So let's try this out. So I'm going to start with a counter variable. I'm going to call this counter variable count, just because that should be familiar from the for loops. So I'm going to create a while loop using this counter variable, which is going to be considered my start from my for loop. And I'll say while count is less than or equal to 10. That could be considered my ending point. And inside of here, I'm just going to print a statement that will repeat every time we go through the loop. But there is one additional thing that I need to add in here, and that is a change of the condition. And that change of the condition in a for loop would just be an increment by, right? We count up, we count down, we count by 1s, we count by 15s. So I'm going to do that. I'm just going to count up by 1. So I'm going to add 1 to the counter every time through. But you've probably seen the shortcut that we have been using. And the shortcut is count plus equals 1. I'm going to call this one the long cut. And then I am going to comment it out so that we're not duplicating that increment of my counter variable. And I need that increment by, or the change of the condition, in order to change my initial value of my count variable from 1 all the way up to 10. So let's run it and see what happens. So I'm seeing that I am running from 1 to 10. So I'm going to add the same kind of print statement on line 10 that I was doing with the for loops to kind of separate the runs of this program. Let's see if we can count down. So I'm going to start my counter variable high. We'll set it to 20. And then I'm going to add a while loop that counts while my counter variable is greater than or equal to 5. So I'm going to start high with 20. I'm going to end low, and then I'm going to print something inside of there. This time I'm also going to include my counter variable so we can see what it's doing. But of course, I need to change the condition. And the way that we're going to change the condition if I want to count down is I'm going to decrement my counter variable or subtract 1 from it every time through the loop. So let's run this one. And now I see that we are counting down from 20 all the way to 5. All right, do you think that I can display all the even numbers between 1 and 20? I'm going to start my counter variable at 2, and then we are going to add a while loop that counts as long as my variable is less than or equal to 20. I do need the change of condition as well, but this time the change of condition is going to increment by 2. So it's going to add 2 to my counter variable each time. And so as long as my count is less than or equal to 20, we start low at 2. We're going to end high at 20, and we're going to increment by 2. And I can see that we are indeed going from 2 to 20. Since we are repeating logic over and over again, we can actually count the number of times that the logic is repeated. So here's an example. We're going to create a variable that's our initial value. I'm going to create a second variable that is going to count the number of times that we go through the loop. So we'll have our while loop with a condition, and then I am going to update my counter variable as well as updating the condition. That counter variable is going to count the number of times that we loop through the while. So here's an example. I'm going to set my count variable to 0, and I'm going to initialize my counter to 1. And then while the count is less than 5, I'm going to increment both my counter variable, and I'm going to change my condition by updating my count by 1. So my counter variable is initialized to 1. The first time through the loop, it will increment it by 1. My counter variable is now 2. The next time through the loop, it increments it by 1 to 3. And by the time I finish the loop, my counter variable is going to equal 6. Here's another example. I'm going to initialize my count variable to 0, but this time I'm going to initialize my counter to 25. Now each time through the loop, I'm going to decrement my counter variable by 2. So the first time through, counter variable is going to be set to 23. The next time through, it is 21. And I'm going to decrement that value by 2 each of the 10 times that I go through the loop. So ultimately, my counter variable will equal 6. This is a great way that I can determine how many times I have gone through the loop or how many times something has happened. So let's try it out. So it certainly makes sense that I should be able to use my counter variable as a counter for the number of times that I run through the program. So let's give this a try. I'm going to create a counter variable. I'm going to call it sale, and I'm going to say while sale is less than 5, we're going to print something inside of this statement, a user-friendly display of sale item 1, sale item 2, sale item 3, and so on. So we'll print which sale item that we are processing, and then of course we have to change the condition by incrementing or adding 1 to my counter variable. And then I'm going to put a print statement. Once I'm done with the while loop, I'm going to put a print statement at the end, which is going to display the value in my counter variable so that we can see if it did indeed count the 5 times that it ran. So I'm seeing processing sale items 0 through 4, and that makes sense because my counter variable started at 0. So if I want to be a little bit more user-friendly, like we were with the happy birthdays and with the counting cookies, I'm going to add 1 in the print statement, so it should be able to say that we are now processing items 1 through 5. When I count them up, I have 5 of them. Now, this seems to make sense because I'm only incrementing by 1. But as you saw in the video or on the presentation, I don't always count up by 1. For instance, on line 30, I'm counting up by 2, and way up here on line 20, I am decrementing by 1. So I know that on line 25, we were trying to display all of the even numbers between 1 and 20. But what if I wanted to know how many of them there were? This time I can't just display my counter variable because it is going to end up with 20. There are not 20 even numbers between 1 and 20. So now I'm going to need a separate counter variable. So this time I'm going to have the same count variable that I did on line 25. I'm going to add a counter variable now, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. I'm going to use the same while statement that says while count is less than or equal to 20 that you see on line 27. And then I am going to change the condition like I did on line 30 by adding 2 to my count variable. I'm also going to print my even number just so I can see it on line 50. I'm going to print it. We're going to change the condition, but we also need to increment the counter. So I'm going to do that by counter plus equals 1. And this is going to increment 1 every time I go through the loop. So in the end, when I print the number of times we went through the loop, we can see the difference between the actual count variable. So the print statement on line 50 inside of the while loop is going to display all of the even numbers. My print statement on line 58 is going to tell me what my counter variable added up to. So let's run it and see what we get. It looks like there are 10 even numbers between 2 and 20. So this is when a counter variable separate from your regular count variable that is controlling the while loop is very valuable. I did want to point out one more difference between these while loops. On line 20, my while condition is inside of parentheses. On lines 37 and lines 49, my while loop condition is not inside of the parentheses, as it has been with all of the other while loops that we have written. And that is because Python does not require the conditions on while loops and if statements to be inside of parentheses.